Nielsen wasn't a programmatic composer in either the romantic or pictorial sense. If he gave a work a title, it was an indication of character or kind, as when Beethoven used the words eroica or pastoral. The music stands on its own feet, but in such cases as these, both Beethoven and Nielsen seem to have felt no harm in letting the listener in on the impulse behind the music. Beethoven said of the Pastoral Symphony that it was more an expression of feeling than painting, and Nielsen said, "The program or title must in itself contain a germ of feeling or movement, but never a crude description of concrete events." Whether Nielsen's symphonies have titles or not, we can still find a steady growth of purely musical mastery in them. It's on this we must concentrate. But the names of his second, third and fourth symphonies do give us an interesting clue to the nature of his human development. In number 1, we find a young composer, very conscious of his own powers, determined to show what he can do, starting at once with a bold stroke, which he then turns into a structural principle for the whole work. But Nielsen was naturally curious, generous, fascinated by life and people, looking outward and around. So the Four Temperaments shows his interest in types of human character. The third symphony, a few years later, shows an exhilarated response to life at large, and an outward growth in mental scope, an expansion in the best sense, hence the title Espansiva, which has nothing to do with physical size or length, or with romantic inflation. The next stage is the perception of life as an evolutionary process that the greatest disasters cannot stop. Whatever happens, something will survive, somehow. So we have the Fourth Symphony, the inextinguishable, or as some say, the unquenchable. I don't dare attempt it in Danish. In English it sounds more pretentious than he intended, but the toughness and power of the music is enough. Without the title, we'd have been aware of something very formidable, as indeed we are in the Fifth Symphony, which has no name. But now we must turn to number 2. Nielsen himself described in a rather amusing program note how he saw some crude pictures in a pub in Zealand, thus getting the idea for a symphony. The four temperaments are the choleric, the phlegmatic, the melancholic, and the sanguine. Like all the other symphonies, this one has an all-embracing key system. The choleric temperament breaks out in a fierce B minor. In a real human personality with a dominant characteristic, streaks of all the other kinds of temperament are present too, and Nielsen's too much of a realist to have his choleric man roaring with rage all the time. He's capable of tenderness and has something noble in him. That was G major. It's the first big change of key in the movement, and in this symphony each movement has a way of anticipating in some noticeable way the key of the next. So the phlegmatic temperament strolls lazily out in G major. There's one surprise in the piece, a sudden loud noise, of which our imperturbable friend takes no notice whatsoever. But it does cause a gorgeous modulation to the key of E flat. E flat minor is the key of the melancholic temperament. There's another connection between these two middle movements. Notice how in each case the melody is introduced by a descending motion, and how the melancholy one is obviously derived from the phlegmatic one. Here they are, one after the other. It's as if too much complacency produces melancholy. But Nielsen's melancholic character is one of his deepest and grandest studies in human nature. I think Brahms would have been lost in admiration for this superb movement. He'd already praised the First Symphony, but didn't live to see any more of Nielsen's work. There's no self-pity in it, simply a wide and deep search for a way out, sometimes brooding, sometimes powerfully heroic. The last great climax opens magnificently in D minor. As the E-flat major in the phlegmatic temperament foreshadowed the E-flat minor of the choleric, so the D minor in the melancholic hints at the D major of the sanguine. But why D major? The other three movements have gone down by major thirds. B, the first movement, to G, the second movement, to E flat, third movement. The obvious thing would be to go down another major third for the finale. That would be B major, so that the symphony could end neatly in the tonic major. And Nielsen number 2 would then be similar to Brahms number 1, but going in the opposite direction. The Brahms movements go upwards by thirds, C, E, A flat and C. When Nielsen avoids the obvious, we can suspect a subtlety, and it's this. If he'd put the last movement in B major, it wouldn't have been B major at all. It would have sounded like C flat major after the E flat minor of the previous slow movement. Far from bringing a brilliant change, it would have seemed too dark and serious. But D major is after all a close relative of the B minor of the first movement. So he ends the E flat minor slow movement on a half close with a chord of B flat major, from which he's able to leap brilliantly into D major with complete sanguinity. Constructive development would be all wrong for the sanguine temperament. It's basically irresponsible and wild. This piece is simple and exhilarating. But subtleties aren't out of the question, because Nielsen is a subtle observer. Eventually there comes a moment of puzzlement, a dark, in some ways rather Haydn-like adagio in C minor. In fact, a recapitulation of the second subject transformed. The reaction of the sanguine character to this is to forget it, to such an extent that he forgets too that D major is the key of the movement, and he tears away into its dominant A major. The symphony ends with a mock pompous march that I find gloriously full of comic elation. When you hear it next, listen to its bass. It's quite magnificent.